but most, I guess, the academic position on when the Gospels were written was after the epistles of Paul, or at least most of them. So the epistles were written first, and that's my understanding. Do you have sort of some evidence, maybe you can shed some light on the idea of the oral tradition or the oral transmission before the Gospels were written, that we know that what was written down was necessarily what was being transmitted?
Yeah. My own personal view is that the Gospels were written much earlier than that, because I think that the book of Acts was written prior to the martyrdom of Paul in the mid-AD 60s. And there are quite a number of reasons to believe that the book of Acts was completed before the mid-AD 60s. Not only is Paul's martyrdom not mentioned, but Jesus' younger brother James' martyrdom isn't mentioned. I spoke of it tonight. It's told by Josephus how James was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem in the mid-AD 60s. Now, James was the head of the Jerusalem church. And do you mean to tell me Luke wouldn't have narrated that if the book of Acts had been written after this? It seems highly improbable. And there are many other things that makes one believe that the book of Acts was written prior to this time. Now, Luke was written prior to Acts because the Gospel of Luke is the first half of this double work, Luke-Acts. So Luke was written probably around AD 57 or so. That's exactly the same date as 1 Corinthians, well, almost exactly the same date as 1 Corinthians 15, about AD 55. So that would put Luke's Gospel at about the same date as some of the Pauline correspondence. And Mark's Gospel was used by Luke, which would put it even earlier. And so I think that the window between the events that they describe and the writing of the Gospels, in the case of Mark and Luke and probably Matthew, is very short indeed. But in any case, to answer your question, it is a gross misrepresentation when skeptics compare the oral transmission of traditions in Judaism to the child's game of telephone, where a message gets garbled and garbled until at the end it doesn't even resemble what started at the beginning. In Judaism, children were taught in elementary school, in the home, and in the synagogue to memorize faithfully massive amounts of sacred tradition and to hand these on faithfully. In an oral culture, the ability to memorize and faithfully transmit tradition was a highly developed and important and prized skill. And the disciples could be counted on to treat the teachings of Jesus with that same sort of care and concern. And indeed, one of the differences between the game of telephone and the disciples' transmission of the traditions about Jesus is that the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and teachings were still alive. They were still around. You could go back to the person at the beginning of the telephone game and say, "What did you say?" He's still there. So that a historian like Richard Bauckham says we really shouldn't talk about oral tradition in this case. We should talk about oral history, because the original eyewitnesses are still around to be questioned, and so it's not just a matter of tradition being handed on. So I think that gives some insight, I hope at least, to why it's so important to try to recover these early sources behind the Gospels, because these drive us right back to a time very, very close to the events themselves, where we have sources that are so early that it would be highly improbable to regard these as a result of a process of legend and mythology.
Thank you very much.
1 Corinthians contains probably the earliest evidence for the resurrection of Christ, and it's actually in a creed, which goes all the way back to the event itself. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8, there is a creed in those verses. And that creed was something that people memorized orally and then passed on to one another. And Paul ultimately wrote them down in 55 AD, or that creed down in 55 AD. And that creed, I don't have time to go into it now, but it's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. Even liberal scholars agree that predates 40 AD. Some say it goes all the way back to the event itself. The Bible is not just a collection of writings, it's also a collection of oral transmission and creeds that go further back than when the books were written, because it was an oral culture. They memorized things orally there. In fact, your ability to remember oral information was prized, unlike it is today. We don't memorize things like they did back then. They had to memorize things and did so. Now, that doesn't mean that these things were altered necessarily, because the event goes all the way back, or the creed goes all the way back to the event itself, and it was checked out by many people. So it's recorded in 55, but the evidence goes back much further, as just about all scholars agree. Now that we've established that, let's point out that if Acts is written by 62, Luke must be prior to that. Why? How do we know that? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. What does Luke say in the very first verse of the book of Acts? In my former work, O excellent Theophilus. Well, that's the same guy Luke is writing to in the Gospel of Luke. What's the former work to Acts? It's got to be Luke. Luke is prior to Acts. In fact, some think that Luke is actually Paul's account of what happened to Jesus. Luke's account of what happened to Jesus, and he's writing to a Roman official named easy for me to say, Theophilus, and he's writing that in order to get Paul out of trouble with the Romans. He's trying to say, look, this guy's done nothing wrong. He starts in Luke and then he continues in Acts. And in Acts he starts to follow. He starts to travel with Paul in Acts chapter 16, because the narrative shifts from they did this, they did that, to we did this in chapter 16 of the book of Acts. If you read it, you'll see the narrative shifts. Luke is actually now traveling with Paul. Now, if Luke is there, many think Mark is prior to Luke, and of course Matthew might be prior to Mark as well. So we've got early testimony here. Also, I may be going out on a limb here, but I'd have to say that Paul wrote all of his works before he died. What do you think? You think that's a fair assessment? It may be going out on a limb, but here are the undisputed works of Paul: 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and Galatians. There are others too, but these are the main ones that will give you the evidence for the resurrection. Okay? Also, and this is the key point, I would say that most, if not all, of the New Testament's written prior to 70 AD. Why? For the same reasons I just gave you with regard to the temple and the city being destroyed. Do you know nowhere in the New Testament does it mention that the temple was destroyed? Oh, actually, it is mentioned in one place. One place. You know where it's mentioned? Jesus actually predicts it. In Matthew chapter 23 and also in Luke, in a parallel passage, he predicts that not one stone will be left upon another. When? Before this generation passes away. When did he say that? He said that probably in about 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. 70 AD. Yet nobody anywhere in the text says, Jesus was right. Which is telling you what? This must have been written prior to 70 AD. The key point here is that this is during the age of the eyewitnesses. It's difficult for historical revisionists to take over while the eyewitnesses are still around. It can be done, but it's difficult, especially in Jerusalem, where the leaders of the church were, and then they spread out, as you know, all over the ancient world. So we have very early testimony. You may have heard some people will date the Gospels late. First of all, when I ask the experts who look into this, guys like Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona, all with PhDs in this kind of evidence, I've asked them, why do liberal scholars date the New Testament documents, like the Gospels in particular, after 80 AD? And you know what their answer is always? They don't really give a reason. It's arbitrary. What do you think the motivation might be? Because if they date them earlier, then they have to accept them as historical eyewitness accounts, and they don't want to do that. Because then maybe this Christianity thing is true.